and welcome to the virtual showroom. Today, I'm going to cover how I take a hardware replacement lead to a full qualified solutions hardware opportunity. Most dealerships already have a process in place, but to level set the meeting today, I'm going to go ahead and quickly cover how I do it. So come along and let's jump into the virtual showroom. So I'm going to go into a process on how our dealership can set ourselves apart from our other competition that's out there. So really what it's going to do, it's going to formalize what most people are already kind of doing, but I want to make sure that I highlight it here so that it kind of makes sense as I move into later presentations. So the first thing that we're going to do in any opportunity is define the current state. I want to understand what the customer is already doing. And this is very important on multiple fronts. So there's certainly the financial side of it. Right? How many printers have you bought? What's your service contract? What's your monthly consumption? But it goes more than that. How are you utilizing that technology? A lot of times there's a very big difference between what the business owners think is being used and what the end users are actually doing. The same thing exists with IT. IT set up all this infrastructure and they have an expectation on how they think it should be used, but a lot of times it differs. So whether you're going to do an enterprise level formal print assessment within the customer's environment, or if you're just going out to a small business that has 1 or 2 printers, you're going to want to define a couple of things in your current state. What is the financial side of that business? And what is the day in the life? What is the day in the life of the IT's group's experience with print, the owner's experience with print, and the end user's experience with print? And once we have an understanding of that, we can move into that business value assessment. And this really is key to develop a formal process here, because this is ultimately what's going to make your dealership better than the rest. So we start out first with that value alignment. So I understand what you're currently doing, and look, my company has all kinds of opportunities to help us do things better. And based on what you're currently spending, we already got an idea of what we can fit into that current spend and improve the experience that you've had. So when that business value starts to build, we're going to be moving into that future vision. Hey, look, this is what we can do for you. And a perfect example of this is what people historically have been doing, which is local direct printing, to what we can offer them today, which would be a universal cloud print experience, where it's not a print driver and a print queue for every single printer out there, but it's just one driver, one interface, and it makes it really easy to print. So that'd be a perfect example of taking somebody from their current state, building a value alignment, and then painting a future vision, and making sure that ultimately we have a good business case. So we want to ensure that that future vision makes sense based on the economics of what their past current state was. So what do I mean by that? Well, chances are I'm not going to get somebody that's going to spend $2,000 to fix a $20 problem. So we have to understand what that future vision is, how much it costs, and whether or not it aligns with what their current state is. And then ultimately, once we understand that business case, we're going to need to present compelling buying profiles, whether that's going to be a purchase price or a lease or maybe a subscription, then put that proposal in front and really ensure that we get a good close. So let's go ahead and move on, and we're going to talk about how we get into our actual sales plan and what we want to sell someone. In the last bit, we talked about how your dealership will build an opportunity, so a very strategic level plan. So now let's bring that down into what that actual opportunity will look like. So typically when we're talking to somebody, we have 2 entry points to developing our future vision. And that's going to be either print management, like you're currently printing, and what can we do to make print better for you, or file management, which typically is scanning. Most people are already scanning to email, and so how can I make that better? So I'm going to come out with some basic management strategies that are going to enhance those 2 starting points. So in print management, it's probably something like, hey, look, you're probably sick of doing, operating system million print queues, printing locally. It's a pain in the rear to manage all of this. And I can make it better for you. I can give you, possibly a universal driver that can print through the cloud. So now you don't have to worry about direct printing. So, there's all kinds of opportunities around that print management side to make the experience of print, both at the end user level and IT, better. And then the same thing with scanning. Most of the time, people are probably scanning through an SMTP relay, and there's all kinds of issues maintaining that, and the file sizes can be too big, and it's just a mess because it just puts a huge amount of payload into the email server. And how can we make that better? So those are starting points for us. We can start to make that better because with each evolution of the software and devices that we're selling, we've improved and adopted new technologies. So at least let me discuss that with you. And then as we get into those use cases, I can probably start to realize that they'll want some type of policy management. What do I mean by policy management? Let's start about cost, right? So if I make it easier to use the devices, then I want to make sure that I give the business owners and the different departmental heads ways to control the cost and consumption to ensure it's meaningful use for the organization. On the flip side, if I'm scanning more and I'm starting to send information, I really want to understand how you're using that information, how you're moving it, and ultimately where you're storing it so that these devices can be an integral part of that process to make sure the entire experience is better. So ultimately, this is how we start to build that future vision as we understand our starting points at either scanning or printing, then how scanning and printing is going to need some type of cost management and content management policies around it to ensure that it fits nicely into any organization. From this point, I'll go into some of the discovery questions because typically this is where people get locked up as they're not sure how to ask questions to get the relative responses. So if we can understand these components as our overall strategy, this discovery process is going to become easy. And let's go ahead and jump into that. So next, we're going to jump into how I do discovery. In the past sections, we talked about, a dealership plan on current state to future vision to business case and all the steps associated to developing a plan of approach. We also talked about how I could narrow that general plan of approach to a specific sales plan and talk about how extending, the device functions that could then draw me into bigger transactions around cost management and content management. Now, what I want to get into is the specific questions I ask to try to flesh out if there is a solution and what value that solution may bring to an organization. So let me go ahead and jump right into that. So I use an information lifecycle that is agnostic to all processes that organizations use to help me identify relevant questions to get somebody to talk about things that they do. And so what's really great about using a process like this is I don't have to worry about product features. I don't have to worry about, marketing slicks. I don't have to worry about anything other than listening to what my potential customer has to say about what they do and help guide them through that process so I can understand how valuable each one of these steps are. So when I look at the terms, and I'll go ahead and go through the definitions of them here real quick, you'll see how it makes it really easy to ask good questions, even when you might not understand their business. So when I start with define, that's all about engagement. How does somebody know when they have work? So typically that's going to be an email, that's going to be paper that comes in from outside, it's going to be somebody calling you. There's some very specific way that's going to notify you as the user that you've got something to do. And then ultimately, the first thing you're going to do when that engagement happens is you're going to evaluate it. You're going to appraise it for its value. Is this something that needs to be done immediately? Is this something that gets scheduled in the future? What kind of resources do I need? So you're going to value or appraise the work that's inbound. Once you know that you've actually got to move and you've got to actually process, you're going to have to transform your raw data into information. So typically there's a lot of ways that people do this. Maybe it's two systems talking back and forth. Maybe it's you doing data entry. Maybe it's you doing calculations. Perhaps you've got a piece of paper that you've got to scan. Either way, you've got to transform that data to get it into usable information. And once it becomes usable information, it's usually got to be captured by something so it can be processed. So, when you look at this, a lot of people do scan to email. So that scan does the transform, email is the capture process, and then ultimately I'm going to process what information's ever in that email. So that could be a PDF, that could be just data in the email, whatever it may be. And as I finish processing, I'm going to route that to some storage spot so it's in the location that it needs to be for someone to be able to use it or consume the information that I've been able to process. Sometimes you do the entire life cycle. Sometimes you're sending information across multiple people, and each person has a different part of this overall life cycle. But once that data is then consumed, It's going to need to be removed from general operations into a more secure location, which typically is some type of archival spot. And after it's sat in the archival spot as long as it needs to, based on whatever your records management policies are or your regulatory obligations, it's then ready to be disposed of. So again, you can use this on any operation within any organization that requires somebody to put effort towards processing something. So that could be just creating a calendar, that could just be processing an invoice. It's anything that's out there. Now, one of the things I want to highlight as we talk through this is the data value arrow that's there. As I progress through this life cycle, data will become more valuable to the organization to the point of consumption where it hits its highest point of value. Once it's been consumed, ultimately from there, it's ready to be disposed of and its value is going to decrease exponentially and very quickly. One of the other things I like to highlight with that, and this is usually your call to action, is the risk associated to that data and eventually information remains high and constant throughout the entire life cycle. So even though we may be capturing a bunch of data at some point, as soon as it's within our organization, it's at risk. And if we lose it, the cost to recovery or to investigate it or to identify it is always extremely high. So we want to make sure that we protect data immediately, get it to its most useful state, and then ultimately destroy it as quickly as possible. So then that way we have as little threat surface as possible. So when we start to hear what somebody does and listen and process and see where we can offer opportunities, what we'll find is at the point of consumption and store, we probably have some very high value solutions that we can offer. And people are probably more willing to invest in those solutions because it's easy to identify that high value. But as we move more to the left into the processing, capture, and transform, which is typically where we start, the value there is a little bit less, so we have a harder time getting people to understand that they should have attached solutions from the device. But ultimately, if we understand what people are telling us and we can show them how we can impact capacity, we can impact security, we can make things better, I think what we can do is we can start to elevate the value of these steps to the point that an investment is warranted. And so using a process like this allows you to ensure that you're asking relevant questions without having to have the necessary business expertise. And based on how people respond to each one of these steps within the life cycle, you can start to get an understanding of what kind of value they're going to place on the solution that you bring to the table. That way that you should be able to have a much higher success ratio when it comes to closing business. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next section. Today I'm going to go over somewhat different approach to how I do demoing. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to talk the sales rep perspective. So I'm going to be product specific and how this product fits into my overall strategy. And then I'll come back and do the customer demo that I typically do. So the big difference that you'll find is that when I do a customer demo, I don't talk about the product specifically. I'm just trying to get the customer to visualize what we can do for them. So then that way, later on in the sales process, if we need to switch out products based on whatever reason, cost or specific one or whatever, we don't have to go back and resell a new product. And that's kind of the key thing. So you'll first see me do it product centric so that you as a sales rep can get an idea of what each one of these applications do. And then you'll come back and see my demo. So let's go ahead and get started with the sales rep version of this. So the first thing I do is I'm going to go over the end user experience with Uniflow. So what you see behind me is a typical print scenario, and what I'm showing is what they get when they buy any printer, which is a Windows driver. They got an application they can configure print from. It's very confusing, whatever. So they got file print. So I'm showing a current state. So I'll go through it and I try to get them to understand that what you see here is a scenario that's been in place since the late 1900s, right? So 1995 was the last time that print was updated. These print drivers are still based on the old 1995 way of printing. And typically most people don't use most of these settings, and really the current state is outdated and we need a refresh on how things work, because most people just want their print in an easy way. They don't want to have to worry about configuring all these different settings, and all of this just kind of adds to the annoyance factor of printing. So then what I want to do is show them what our future vision is, which is a universal print experience, right? So one driver that works with any printer, And, you know, with Uniflow, it's a PCL driver. So as long as their printer has been around since 1995 and supports PCL, it's going to work. And as you can see, the interface here is far more simplistic than what we just showed. So really, this is all about making the end user experience a lot more simplistic, and about how, you know, it's going to be able to support any printing from 1995 forward as long as it supports PCL. So I really wanted to try to make this nice and easy. I also wanted to show how we can extend off the old way and be able to send print jobs either to a direct output queue like they're used to, or to a virtual service. And since this is Uniflow, and Uniflow Online specifically, there's no servers here. So we can get rid of all the print servers and all the old things that make printing very complex and very annoying. So no additional queues needed, just a single queue. No servers needed, it's just a web service. And as long as it's a printer that's been around since 95 and supports PCL, it's going to work. So really what I've tried to do here is show the end user experience and how easy it is to be able to print. We briefly went into the future vision when it comes to the end user experience associated to print. And so I wanted to continue that conversation a little bit further to show how not only do we make the historical current state of printing better, but we can extend much further utilizing Uniflow. So let's go ahead and jump into that. So the first thing you'll see that when I bring this up is that everything is a web page. There's nothing here that requires a local server. So first off, we've greatly simplified the mechanics of everything because we're not relying on a client server architecture, which, you know, client server architecture was you know, its heyday was years ago, decades ago. And really we've moved to web services and what's known as zero trust, meaning that everything kind of talks to a web service and then it comes back down. So we're able to support the current architecture of today and what will most likely be the current architecture for a long time to come. And so as we continue down our pathway of simplify and evolve, this is how we're satisfying the end user condition with evolving, because we're here with this web service, and this web service will allow us to continue to connect with new services that become available. And how do I know that? Well, let's kind of go through the interface and see. So the biggest thing I wanted to highlight at this point is the area down here to the lower right corner, which is called identities. And first off, this web service is going to be very, you can configure these widgets to be how you want. So this is how I've done it. And, you know, just before I go into the identities part, let me just kind of cover that. So up at the top, I have my budgets, so I can support putting a cost control process in place. So I can state how much money an end user has in different wallets that pay for that print. And then they can come in and see how much money they have left. This notification sections here to the lower left here. This is what allows me to help end users do end user tasks when managing their experience with print. Right here, I have my queue, and these are all the different print jobs that I've sent up to the system. And as you can see, one of the key features here is this handover function. So if I've sent a print job to the system and I'm not going to be in the office for a little while, but I need it printed, I can just go ahead and hand over that print job to another user, and they can print it on my behalf. The other thing that I can do is I can access my my ability to send files or print files from different systems. And this is kind of a key thing to remember. As time goes on, we're going to have new web services, we're going to have new storage technologies, we're going to have new ways to access things, and I want to make sure that my system can evolve with that. And since I am a web service, this identities section is what allows me to interconnect from different websites and keychain together usernames and passwords, so I don't have to keep entering in usernames and passwords, and I can support modern authentication. And so this is kind of that area on where I monitor that. So most end users probably don't have to do a whole lot in this area. The biggest end user interaction is going to be with your secure queue and whether or not you're going to hand over a job or delete it. What's going to probably be the most important to most end users is this next section right here. So in Uniflow Online, I have this Start Printing section that allows me to upload a file to the system. It lets me email a job to the system. If I need to have that one printer object that I showed in the historical print demo earlier, I can download it directly here, both for Mac and for Windows. I have the ability to get mobile apps from iOS or Android that allow me to manage my queue and see my print consumption and be able to release print jobs. I also have this Chrome extension that allows me to directly connect to Google's print scenario, their enterprise printing. So this really makes it easy for me as a user to self-maintain my relationship to print. So, you know, as an administrator, I can decide what's on this page, so I can control it and kind of remove aspects of it if I want to, or I can empower end users to be able to do a lot more. Like, for instance, I don't have to publish the Windows or the Mac driver if I don't want to. I can decide which versions I'm publishing. So there's a lot of control here. And then the end user can just utilize whatever we want to make available to them. This last section here is extension, and this is more for scan, and I'll talk more about this later, but basically I've got the ability to manage my filing assist, which is a zone OCR workflow component that we'll talk about later, but that's also here for people to be able to access. So as you can see, we can do what Windows gave us access to long ago, or Apple, but now we can extend upon it into a website that gives me a lot more control, both for print and for scan. One thing I do want to point out, this is also for guest printing too. So even somebody that's not in the network, if I wanted to, I can give them this email address and they can email in a print job. And if I've turned on guest printing, they'll get a job code back that will be able to release it. So Uniflow, from an end user experience, helps us realize that future state of controlling the assets, making sure it evolves over time, and simplifying it for anyone that wants to use it. They can either just engage in the historical way that they already know how to print, or if they want to use these other methods, they've got their own web portal that walks them through each one of these capabilities. So I hope with that, you're getting an understanding how Uniflow plays a big part in our overall solution selling strategy of being able to solve problems for end users, especially when it comes to, you know, dealing with that kind of proprietary, overcomplicated print scenario that most people are currently facing. So with historical printing, what you'll find is that it's overly complex for really no good reason. So when I hit File, Print, and I take a look at it, the first thing I notice, there's application settings that are trying to control print. And that may or may not work. It all depends on your printer and what your printer's trying to do, but it certainly can create a whole bunch of errors. Because if I do create conflicting error commands, I'm going to get a bunch of garbage printing out of the printer. The other thing is there's a million different queues, and each one of these queues has its own interface that I have to learn, which most of the time I don't want to spend the time doing. I mean, when I bring up one of these interfaces, look at this. I've got a million settings on each one of these tabs. And most of the time, I'm just looking for a paper as quickly as possible. I would guess the majority of the time I'm just really doing 1 or 2 pages. I'm really just trying to get my information quickly without having to put too much work into it. And this is directly getting in my way of doing that. So how can I make this easier? There's got to be an easier way to do it. Well, what I can do is I can put a single driver that will control all printers. And so I'm going to go ahead and select that right now. This driver right here will be the last driver you have to learn, and it will work with any printer. So when I hit the printer properties here, notice no more tabs, just one tab. And on that one tab are the most common settings that I probably need. And probably 95% of the time, this is all I need. In fact, even this is probably more than I need. But I've got all the major settings. And as long as my printer is PCL and it's been around since at least 1995, it's probably going to work with this system, and this driver will be able to configure it and get output on it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, and I'm going to print it. Now, since I only have one driver, but I have multiple printers, I'm going to need to know where to send it. Well, this pop-up will come up, and it'll let me send it to a direct output queue or to the secure print queue here. That secure print queue is going to allow me to retrieve it from any connected printer, either through a QR code or directly using an app on the control panel. And all these other queues are what are called direct output queues, and they're just like Microsoft. So I'd select it, and the paper's going to be waiting for me. But one add-on here is I can actually attach a location to it. So then that way, if I've got multiple offices, I know which printer is where, so it's easier for me to go retrieve it. And as you can see with that, I've made it very easy to be able to print for end users. All right, so we just talked about what the end user experience would look like and the fact that we can make things easier and still support the historical way that people want to print, and now move on to how we would manage that and how we can make it easier for people to be able to maintain the system and allow end users to have that easy experience. So when you look at the dashboard for the management side, you'll find that it looks very similar to the user portal, only there's more options down the side. So when we first look at the system, the first thing we see is that we can see users and we can see devices. Let's talk about users really quickly. So what we want to do is be able to get users provisioned and access to the system as quickly as possible. And there are a number of different ways that we can do that. We can connect directly to your current identity provider, like if you're using Office 365 or some other type of OpenID Connect or some other type of SAML or OAuth2, we can use that. We can use a self-registration, so that way end users can go to the web page of the system, register their company email address or any email address you want them to use, and then it will send them a user account to allow them to log on. We can manually create users if you don't have some other way to identify who's using the system or not. And we've got a way to provision a lot of users by uploading the CSV. So we've made it very easy to get people access to your print management system, whether it's fully integrated into your current systems or whether we're going to manage this as a separate system so that we can, maintain some separation between systems. That's adding users. Let's talk about adding devices. With devices, when you look at how you historically do it, you create a server queue, which requires you to have to go out to the manufacturing website, look up the model number, look up the right version of the driver, download that driver, install it onto the server, and create an output queue, and then share that output queue. And then you have to go repeat most of those steps at the workstation for each one of those output queues. That becomes a gigantic task whenever you're trying to change your fleet or deal with any type of print environment change that's going to impact end user printing. What we've done is we've made that massively easier. You look at adding the devices, you basically have three choices. The first one is if you've got a firmware integration to the device itself, I'm going to use a mobile app infrastructure. What that means is I'm going to go to the control panel. I'm going to say connect to Uniflow. I hit that button. I put in this license key and the printer will go out to the web service, pull down all the applications and everything that it needs, provision itself, and it's now ready to be used. If you've got a bunch of machines and you don't want to go to each one of them, we also have a utility that you can download to your desktop and basically add in a long list of IP addresses and it will do the same thing for you. So if the machine is integrated all the way down to the firmware, we've made it very, very simple to provision it and get it accessed for end users to use. And when I mean it's accessible, if you think about how we showed print just a moment ago, they have that one printer object. Well, as I add printers to the server side of this, it just becomes available. You don't have to do anything on the workstation side of it. If we have a tablet integration, so we do have a tablet that you can put on legacy machines that give you a more in-depth experience with print. We also can support these legacy devices. So any printer that has a PCL interpreter on it, which PCL hasn't been updated since 95, like what we talked about. So if your printer was manufactured post 1995, most likely it's going to be able to work with this system. So all we're going to do is name the printer. We have to put in a serial number for right now, but it can be anything. Put in the IP address of the printer. And then from here, we've got a list of models that we support. So what we've done with the system is we said, why does the IT person have to go and figure out what printer that they use? What we're going to do is we're going to maintain the database for you. So we work with all the major manufacturers. So as you saw, we got Brother, we got a bunch of Canons. Once we get past the Canons, you'll see that we support Epson and Dell and Fiery and Gestetner, HP, so lots and lots of manufacturers. Pretty much anyone that supports PCL, we've done an integration with. So you'll be able to select whatever driver you want. If you're doing a cost management policies as well, we can apply that pricing profile to make sure that we can account for all the usage of the device. And once I hit finish, this print queue is now available and end users will be able to be allowed to use it. So in essence, we no longer have to touch each workstation whenever we add a printer. So that's how we've greatly simplified access to print. So when you look at how all of this works, that's probably one of the highest amount of overhead that most IT people have to maintain, which is the queues on the server and the queues on the workstation and making sure the two connect. Well, you no longer need to do that. We also can allow for mobile printing here. So when you look at mobile printing, it's just a checkbox that you enable and it goes back to that end user experience. So instead of them having to install drivers and go through all the rigmarole to be connected to your infrastructure, we can just enable it. It's going to use the email to print workflow, and it's going to email them back a job code, and you can set up those job codes here if you so choose. If the device has a firmware level integration like what we talked about earlier, we can also create ACLs, access control lists, that allow us to provide access or policy management all the way down to the function of the machine. So if we want to allow people to have access to print or print in color or print to a mailbox, we can turn that on or off based on end user or group. We also have the access to control copy, which becomes an important factor as we try to apply or overlay a cost management strategy to our overall fleet management strategy. And what that means is a lot of folks, once they notice that they are being managed when it comes to print, will switch their printing to copying. So they'll print once, copy many. So we do have the ability to apply our policies not only to print, but to copy as well, and scanning and the rest of the functions of the machine. So this becomes a very good central policy management utility when it comes to not only controlling the fleet, but applying a cost management strategy that doesn't push the burden of that policy onto the end user. They just learn how to do business and they don't have to think about the rest. Once we get done with print, we can start to look at scanning, because printing and scanning are pretty much the same workflow, only in reverse. So if we look at scanning, we can go ahead and create scanning profiles that will roll down to the device the same way that print does, meaning that I configure it here on the service and it will push down to the machines that I choose to put it on. And so these scanning buttons can be controlled by device, user, or group. And as you can see, I can connect to all the major services that are out there. So we can connect to most of the major cloud services, as well as some specialty ones like Therefore, or even a filing assist workflow, which I'll go into shortly later. But we also do connect to like Teams, Exchange Online, desktop, local scanning, and we can create a very quick scan to myself, meaning that it's going to grab that attachment and just email it back to you. So lots of ways to be able to capture those scans and get them where you need them. Not only can we deliver them to a location, but we can apply workflow elements to them to help simplify mundane tasks, which is an important concept as we start to look to invest in new technology. The whole idea of investing in new technology is to remove the least valuable steps from each workflow that people engage. So when you look at scanning, for instance, a lot of times people at the point of scanning don't really think about what the person at the reception of that scan has to do with that information. For instance, a lot of time invoices come into a mailroom or a receptionist or a front office worker. They just grab them all up, throw them in the feeder, and send it as one file. Well, that single file comes back to somebody in accounting, and what do they usually have to do? They have to then collate those into separate files so that they can then process each one of those invoices. Well, a lot of times how that process is executed is the only option that accounting person has is print it, manually collate it, scan it back. Well, with these types of workflow elements, we can address those types of concerns and say, you know what, let's make this easy for people. So I'm going to go drop it off for them, but you know what, I want to make it easy for the person in the front office. I want to make it easy for the person that's in accounting. So what I'm going to do is put a workflow element in between that's going to automatically separate those files. So then that way, each one of those users can focus more on what's most important for them. So when this screen comes up, what you'll see is we have the ability to select different elements and build a workflow, but it's a wizard-driven process, so it's not going to take a long time for somebody to learn all the ins and outs of scanning and be an expert on this. A end user or power user can be able to set these types of jobs up. So we can name it, we can decide where it's going to get stored, we can create rules on how it's going to generate file paths. So if we want to dynamically change file paths, we can. And here's how we can decide how we're going to split into separate files. So if we know every invoice is one page, we can just say split every page. Or if we've got variable pages and no other way to really understand how we're going to split it, we can ask the person at the front desk just to insert a blank page between each one, or we can use barcodes. So then that way they throw the pile on, they hit scan, it's a single scan, and when it gets received, it's broken up into its different files. So there's a number of these types of workflows here that allow us to more easily manage scan and distribute that scan to the people that most need it. So we've talked a little bit about printing, we talked a little bit about scanning, not only on how people get access to it, but how we can make their life easier by utilizing some of these small workflow elements. When it comes to the system itself, how do we maintain the system? So we've added the things that we're going to use, but how do updates come down? Do we need maintenance windows? All the things that IT historically does with a server infrastructure. Well, the good news is, since we're using a cloud service, there is no maintenance window. When there's a new update that's released, it's released in the background, and you as an IT person won't have to install that hot fix or that patch or that feature upgrade request. It'll just become available. And how does it become available? Well, right here under this add extensions. So we create these extensions. They then go into this library, and then you can decide which ones you're going to bring into your tenant and make available for your end users. And as you can see, I've got a few that I haven't added just so you can see what they look like when they become available. And so on a quarterly basis, we release updates when they come out. This is where you'll see that they are now available. Okay, and once you do get those extensions available for your end users, just like the scanning profiles, you'll be able to go into them, and they're all wizard driven. So this one is that printer object that I showed in the end user workflow, and you can see I can decide how I'm going to monitor my printers. I can figure out how I'm going to create that installer for that printer object on the workstation. So if I go under Windows, you can see I have a bunch of MSI enable it features so I can make it look the way that you want. And since it is an MSI, you can also plug it into your current infrastructure on how you roll out different applications. So each one of these extensions are some type of element that you're going to use in your overall system, and they all follow this kind of same cadence with going through wizards to be able to configure everything. And so we can go deeper into those elements if you have any questions, but overall, this is where you manage the features that then become available for your end users. If you are doing a cost management strategy, you'll be able to get access to your reporting. The reporting database is going to be able to basically track usage, group, and device usage. So I'll be able to look at group, department, user, and device. And then from there, I can look at a summary, or I can look at more specific information. Right? I can also export that information so that I can do my own data analytics. So not only do we have that reporting engine, but we also can provide you the data set. And we're going to store that data set on our service for up to 60 months. So you do have access to deep reporting as well. Some of the other things here go a little bit deeper, but we have a lot of different ways to customize the experience of the tenant and the environment to meet your different goals. So based on what you're looking to do, we can usually accommodate most requests. But if for some reason you get into something that is very, very, very specific, this web service also has access to all the local installers, and you can stand up a local server that can get much more in depth in its customization based on your environment. But most of the time what we find is this covers 85 to 95% of everyone's wants, and really only that 5% of the time do we ever have to address something that's very specific. One last item that I talk about when it comes to fleet management is we are location aware. That location aware, it appears like it's geotagged, but really it's IP address. So we have the ability to create a location very quickly. You can put in the geotag if you want. I think it's going to make me do it. Okay, there it is. And then when I go in that new office and edit it, I can say what the IP address is. And basically what that does is when you log into the client knows your IP address. It's going to match it against this database of locations and IP addresses, and then from there you can use that location data to decide which printers are exposed and that pop-up that we talked about in the end user experience. So all in all, when you look at the service itself, we've kind of removed the complexity of Windows infrastructure, and we brought to you the features and the settings that are most specific to what people want, which is how do I scan, how do I print, how do I make it as easy as possible. From an IT perspective, you're only going to have to set up the web service, and the devices and the end user follow whatever you put on the server. So there's no need to engage the end user's device to be able to then allow them to see what you've done on the server. It just becomes available. So that's how we're going to manage the system. I'm going to go ahead and move on into some of the deeper automation that we can do from a workflow integration perspective. If you have any questions, let me know. As we come to a close, I just wanted to give you a couple of bits of information and let you know that I have some goodies for you to be able to use. So first off, the 2 customer demos that I just went over, those are videos that you can download. They won't have any audio on them, but I do have a caption file for each one that you can either use in a teleprompter software or as captions in some type of video player, or you can just use it as a text file and read. So that way you can practice doing a demo, both for the end user experience as well as fleet management. Also, all the digital media assets that you see me using in my presentation, there's a link there. You can download and use those. I also encourage you to give me a call because I do have a lot of these exercises that I can bring out to you at your dealership. We can work in person where you can take what I'm doing and develop your own voice on top of it, because I know you have a wealth of experience that you could probably add and enrich this kind of baseline setup that I have. But until then, I'd like to say thank you for your time, and I can't wait to see you again in the virtual showroom.